You think the rich are preparing for collapse. They aren't. And that misunderstanding is already costing you time. Preparation means bracing for impact. It means assuming you'll still be inside the failure when it happens. Stockpiling, reinforcing, enduring. That's what people do when they believe the system will remain relevant tomorrow. The people with real leverage stopped believing that years ago. This is about you, right now. Because while you're learning how to survive without electricity, they're designing how to survive without you. Not bunkers buried in forests. Not romantic self-sufficiency. Separation. Distance. Redundancy that never touches the public layer. Their goal isn't survival. It's exclusion without confrontation. This is where most people get it wrong. They imagine collapse as an event, a shockwave, a single moment everyone experiences together. That idea is comforting. It implies fairness. It's also false. Collapse is uneven. It arrives in layers, and the first layer is always exit. Quiet, legal, unannounced. The mistake doesn't hurt immediately. It hurts later when you notice the systems still function, flights still leave, data still moves, supply chains still exist. They're just quieter, narrower, privatized. You're told things are strained. Temporary. Meanwhile, others experience no interruption at all. Remember this. When the wealthy talk about resilience, they're not talking about grit or skills. They're talking about insulation, about removing dependency on shared systems before those systems become liabilities. Their fear isn't collapse, it's being trapped in it with everyone else. You're being trained to endure discomfort. They're engineering absence. Absence from public risk. Absence from accountability. Absence from volatility. You're told endurance builds character. They know endurance builds exposure. The longer you stay inside failing systems, the more visible you become to their consequences. And it gets worse. Because the infrastructure you rely on doesn't vanish, it fragments, portions are sealed off. Access becomes credentialed. What used to be public becomes conditional. The lights don't go out everywhere. They go out selectively. That selectivity is the signal. That's the tell. When failure arrives and the powerful don't panic, it's because they've already stepped sideways. They aren't hoarding supplies. They're hoarding continuity. Places where life proceeds normally while the rest of the world debates causes and assigns blame. By the time you start preparing seriously, you're not late to the collapse. You're late to the exit. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see where the survivors are watching from, and hit subscribe while you're here. You don't notice the separation at first because it doesn't announce itself. There are no barricades, no warnings, no moment you can point to and say this is when it happened. Instead, it arrives as a minor inconvenience, a service that takes longer, a call that doesn't get returned, a delay that only seems to affect certain people. That asymmetry is the signal, and most people dismiss it as noise. This is the part everyone misses. They think inequality shows up as visible wealth, cars, houses, displays of excess. That's outdated. Real inequality shows up as options. Who can leave on short notice? Who can reroute without asking? Who never has to wait in the same line twice? The rich aren't preparing for chaos. They're preparing for continuity without friction. The delayed consequence arrives quietly. When systems begin to fail, you're told to adapt, to conserve, to be patient, to accept temporary hardship for long-term stability. Meanwhile, parallel systems continue operating normally. Private logistics networks, private healthcare, private security, private utilities. They aren't hidden. They're simply unreachable, sealed behind credentials you don't have. This is where it turns lethal, because once separation becomes routine, it becomes defensible. Scarcity gets explained as necessity. Exclusion becomes efficiency. Hard choices are discussed as if everyone is sharing the cost. They aren't. Those who exited the shared layer don't experience these choices at all. They observe them from a distance. The reframe matters here. It's not that the rich will survive collapse better. That's too simple. It's that they won't experience collapse in the same form. What feels like breakdown to you feels like background noise to them. Different systems, different rules, different thresholds for inconvenience. While you're preparing for shortages, they're preparing for insulation. Insulation from unrest, from volatility, from accountability. Hunger isn't their risk, exposure is. Being reachable, being affected by decisions made for the public layer. Everything they build is designed to reduce contact with those risks before they spike. Remember this detail. Every time you hear about a resilient community built from scratch, ask who it's meant to keep out. Every private solution removes pressure to repair the public one. Every exit weakens the floor beneath those who remain standing on it. Fragmentation isn't a side effect. It's the mechanism, and it gets worse again. Once enough people exit, collapse accelerates for everyone else. Maintenance slows because it no longer benefits those with influence. Investment dries up because returns are now private. The system isn't saved because it's allowed to fail. Its failure stops being costly to the people who could prevent it. At that point, you're not surviving. You're occupying abandoned infrastructure, living inside something that still exists physically but has been strategically deserted. And the most dangerous part is this. From the outside, it still looks like society. By now, the pattern should be visible if you're willing to look at it without comfort. Collapse isn't a shared disaster. It never was. It's a sorting mechanism that activates under stress. Some people brace for impact. Others reposition before impact exists. The difference isn't awareness. It's permission. This is where most people get caught. They mistake activity for resistance. They believe prepping is defiance. It isn't. Prepping accepts the frame. It assumes the future will be smaller, harsher, and that your role is to adapt downward. Learning how to survive inside the ruins doesn't challenge why the exits were never designed for you. The mistake doesn't announce itself. It shows up later, quietly, when you notice no one is coming back. The people who left don't return to rebuild. They don't reintegrate. Their systems don't require it. Reintegration introduces noise, risk, friction. Their continuity was designed without you from the start. Remember this. Breakaway civilizations aren't science fiction. They don't need lasers or domes. They need logistics, jurisdiction, distance, remote compounds with private supply. Charter cities with custom rules. Networked enclaves where collapse exists only as an external variable, something to be monitored, not endured. You're told to become self-reliant. That sounds empowering until you understand the contrast. Self-reliance keeps you inside the problem. System independence removes the problem entirely. While you're learning to fix what breaks, they're ensuring nothing you touch is essential to their continuity. And it gets worse. Because once separation is complete, the narrative inverts. The population left behind is reframed as unstable, volatile, unpredictable. Not because it's true, but because it's useful. Control stops looking like oppression and starts looking like management. This is where surveillance expands. Movement becomes conditional. Access is rationed, not to protect you, but to contain risk. You're told it's temporary, necessary, for safety. But safety in this context means protecting continuity elsewhere from the instability concentrated around you. The reframe is brutal. Collapse isn't the end of the world. It's the transition into a world where continuity is privatized, where stability is no longer a public good, but a gated service, where disorder is localized and managed instead of resolved. If you're still preparing to survive inside the collapse, you've already accepted your position within it. Survival at that point isn't about skills or intelligence. It's about inclusion. Tomorrow doesn't ask if you're ready. It only checks where you're allowed to go. At some point, collapse stops looking like failure and starts looking like policy, not announced, not voted on, just enacted through omission. That's when fear becomes rational, not because everything is breaking, but because nothing is being fixed on purpose. This is where most people misread what they're seeing. They assume abandonment is accidental, that elites were simply luckier, smarter, better prepared, that they escaped because opportunity presented itself. The truth is colder. Separation outperforms repair. Once that becomes clear, repair stops being a priority. You don't fix what you no longer depend on. The delayed consequence doesn't arrive as violence. It arrives as neglect. Roads crack and stay cracked. Services pause and never fully resume. Power flickers, not everywhere, just where it no longer matters. You're told it's temporary, that recovery takes time. Meanwhile, there are places where none of this happens at all. Remember this. Collapse accelerates where influence retreats. The moment decision makers stop relying on shared infrastructure, that infrastructure becomes expendable. Systems don't fail because they're impossible to maintain. They fail because the people who benefit from maintaining them have already exited the blast radius. And it gets worse, because neglect doesn't remain neutral. It demands explanation. Once decay is normalized, blame follows. You're told the system failed because people abused it, because they were irresponsible, because they didn't adapt quickly enough. Failure is reframed as personal instead of structural. This is where it turns lethal. When scarcity is framed as behavioral failure, enforcement replaces support. Restrictions appear where assistance used to be. Access controls tighten. Movement becomes conditional. Not to repair the system, but to manage the population still trapped inside it. Management is cheaper than rebuilding. Watch the language shift. Words like efficiency, sustainability, realism, they're used to justify withdrawal. Support is phased out quietly, expectations are lowered. You're told to adjust, to be resilient, to accept limits. Meanwhile, elsewhere, limits don't exist. The reframe is uncomfortable. This isn't survival of the fittest. It's survival of the disconnected. Those who exited early don't need order restored. They already have it. Their concern isn't collapse, it's spillover. Containment. Ensuring instability doesn't cross into insulated zones where continuity still matters. At that point, you're no longer a participant in society. You're a variable to be controlled. Your movement, consumption, behavior, monitored not to help you, but to keep failure localized. Stability is preserved elsewhere by allowing decay to concentrate here. Collapse doesn't end in chaos. It settles. Unevenly. Predictably. With some lives continuing uninterrupted while others are slowly reclassified as acceptable loss. That's when you realize collapse wasn't a breakdown. It was a reallocation. Eventually, people stop asking when things will go back to normal. That question assumes normal is shared, waiting somewhere ahead. What replaces it is quieter and more dangerous. Who still has normal? That's when the truth becomes unavoidable. The future wasn't postponed. It was redistributed, allocated unevenly, and sealed behind decisions you weren't part of. This is where most people get caught again. They believe endurance earns reintegration, that if they absorb enough disruption, access will be restored. But the systems on the other side were never built for return. They're built for exclusion. Clean inputs, predictable behavior. No friction from mass dependency. Reintegration would reintroduce the very instability they paid to escape. The mistake doesn't punish immediately. It waits until you realize the rules changed without consulting you. Credentials replace rights. Permissions replace access. What once required no justification now demands explanation, and explanations are evaluated by systems that no longer recognize you as a stakeholder. Remember this detail. Breakaway systems never declare permanence. They present themselves as temporary measures, pilot programs, emergency adaptations, just long enough to become indispensable to the people inside them. Once dependence forms, reconnection becomes a risk, not a benefit. The outside world turns into a variable to manage, not a community to rejoin. And it gets worse, because inequality stops being measured in money. It becomes geographic and procedural, mobility, permission, who crosses boundaries without being questioned. Who submits to checks? Who lives in zones of continuity versus zones of exception? Borders no longer map nations, they map functionality. The reframe matters here. You're not being abandoned because you failed, you're being abandoned because you're expensive to include. Shared systems are inefficient by design. They spread risk, slow decisions, and require compromise. Private systems are optimized. Controlled. Once optimization wins, inclusion becomes a liability that undermines performance. This is where the language shifts. Words like resilience, self-reliance, adaptation. They're framed as empowerment, but they function as permission to withdraw support. You're encouraged to cope because coping is cheaper than repair. Every person who learns to endure less makes abandonment easier to justify. Watch what happens next. Responsibility is individualized. Systemic failure is reframed as personal inadequacy. If you struggle, it's because you didn't adapt fast enough. If you fall behind, it's because you made poor choices. The structure disappears behind a narrative of merit, even as access narrows. At that point, collapse isn't something you survive. It's something you're assigned to, a condition you inhabit while others pass through uninterrupted. The future continues, efficient, stable, insulated, just not evenly. And not with you in mind. By the end, collapse no longer feels like an emergency. Emergencies demand response, urgency, shared attention. This doesn't. It settles. It maps itself onto space. Collapse becomes geography. Some areas function. Others degrade. Some lives continue with minimal interruption. Others fragment into improvisation. This isn't chaos. It's segmentation stable enough to persist. This is the detail people forget. Breakaway civilizations don't need conquest. They don't need dominance or spectacle. They only need to remain unreachable. Distance does the work. Jurisdiction does the work. Time finishes the separation. Infrastructure decays where maintenance is no longer profitable. Order persists where it's insulated from the public layer. The delayed consequence isn't physical, it's psychological. People internalize the boundary. They stop imagining access. Stop asking how to cross. Stop questioning why some systems still work and others don't. They learn the limits of their movement and plan within them. That's when separation becomes permanent, not through force, but through acceptance. And it gets worse, one last time, because once the divide stabilizes, it becomes moralized. Continuity is framed as virtue, disorder as failure. Stability is described as earned, instability as deserved. Those outside continuity are portrayed as unpredictable, dangerous, unfit for reintegration, not because it's true, but because it justifies exclusion without confrontation. Remember this, the rich didn't prepare to survive collapse. They prepared to outlive accountability. Accountability requires proximity, shared systems, mutual dependence. Once those disappear, responsibility evaporates with them. They aren't hiding underground. They're stepping into futures where your collapse is ambient noise, background static, something managed at a distance. Their lives don't feel post-apocalyptic. They feel normal, predictable, continuous. That's the point. By the time you're perfecting survival skills, the decisive moment has already passed. The question wasn't whether society would continue, it was who it would continue for. Skills don't grant access. Endurance doesn't reopen gates. Those decisions were made upstream, long before collapse was acknowledged publicly. Survival, in that world, isn't about intelligence or strength. It's about inclusion. About whether you were ever meant to cross into continuity in the first place. Whether the systems ahead of you recognize you as worth carrying forward. Tomorrow doesn't arrive equally. It arrives with permissions. And most people never had them.